and let's explore together what God is saying to us. Now, the end of Ruth chapter 3, to some extent, left us on a little bit of a knife edge. If you notice, if you go back to the end of chapter 3, Naomi says to Ruth, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Now, the knife edge wasn't going to last very long, but I want to just reflect a little bit on that waiting time. One of the difficulties, is that a problem? I don't know, we have, is that we know the end of the story. Okay, we know the end of the story of Ruth. We know it all works out well. We know the end of the story of the Bible. We live as followers of Jesus in life after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Now we live in this waiting period before Jesus comes back. Okay? But we know and we believe and we live in that sense of hope of what is going to happen. But actually, this waiting period is a time of actually not knowing what is going to happen. If you think about Naomi and Ruth at this moment in time, you know, Ruth has been to Boaz and sort of he's promised, yes, you know, we're going to sort this out. And he says, you know, as Mohan was sharing with us last week, I will not settle. He will not settle until this matter. He will not rest until this matter is settled. But this waiting time can be a difficult time. But it's an important time. I'm reminded, to some extent, in this waiting time, in the book of Job. Job is one of my favourite books of the Bible. Deb says you have like 1 million favourite Bible verses, probably 1 million favourite Bible books. Actually, you can't have 1 million, I understand. But you know, Job is one of my favourite books of the Bible because you have this man who everything's going well, and then it goes horrendously bad. And in the midst of the bad stuff, he says this: "I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. I, and not another, how my heart yearns within me." And then after that, the trouble continues. Now, we know the story of Job. We know ultimately it ends well. But in this middle bit, we did not know it was going to end well. Job did not know it was going to end well. And this waiting is an important part of the journey of faith. Just last night, Deb and myself watched an event from London. Was it Prom Praise? Prom Praise. Royal Albert Hall, filled, big orchestra, big choir from all sorts of plays. And it was, the focus was on an organisation called Sat7, which does ministry through television programs in the Middle East. And they've got bases in Lebanon, in Cyprus. They broadcast, all their programs go from Morocco in the west of North Africa all the way through into Central Asia. Programs in Arabic, Persian and Turkish. And one of the things that came out, especially as you think about the situation in the Middle East, think about the situation in Lebanon, was sort of the testimonies of the believers from that area was, yeah, we're in a difficult place, but we live in the hope of what God is doing and how God is working. Now, does that change the fact that Beirut, or the south of Lebanon, is being bombed? It doesn't. Does that change the reality of their life? Well, one of the testimonies that came from one of the workers for this organisation, Sat7, he said, worship is louder than war. And so just this sense of hope coming out of this waiting period. And so I just want us just to remember, just to be aware of this waiting. We live in the light of the result of the story. But actually, Naomi, Ruth, Boaz, all the people who were living it went through this waiting period. And it's our there are times when we are going to go through a waiting period. We're going to have to walk alongside people who are going through a waiting period. And so to come alongside people, as we're talking about on Wednesday at our Bible studies, what is it to come alongside people? What is it to walk alongside them as they're waiting? So we have here Naomi and Ruth who are waiting for something to happen. So we come into Ruth chapter 4, and I'm going to pick up on where I started. Those of you who weren't here a few weeks ago, I started looking at Ruth chapter 1 by looking. Why have I put the 5 W's? I must have. I'm not sure why I called it. I've had an absolute brain fade when I've been preparing. It should be the 5 M's. Where WK?
Just switch it round.
Yeah, I've suddenly become like dyslexic or something like that. Overnight, it should be the 5 M's. I could go down, I'll just leave it. Where you see W, read M. Okay? I could just say my computer's messed around with me. The 5 M's. And we've looked at this these lenses that we can look at the book of Ruth on. Of migration, the marginalised, I cheated once, I used the Spanish word, the mujeres, the women, the mercy or the hesed, loving kindness, and Messiah. And as we've been looking at the book of Ruth, we can see these areas of migration, the marginalised, the mujeres or the women. Maybe it was the W from the women that messed with me. The mercy and the Messiah. We can see these coming all the way through the book of Ruth. And so as we come to look at Ruth chapter 4, I'm going to go back to those 5 M's, and we're going to sort of dance around them a little bit, but that's going to be sort of the structure as we look at these 5 M's. But I want us just to initially look at this idea of redemption, because redemption is sort of what comes all the way through the book of Ruth. Mohan sort of touched on this last week, the Goel, the kinsman or the guardian redeemer. But I wanted just to just reflect a little bit. What is redemption? What does redemption look like? And what does redemption feel like? Redemption is essentially things being back to the way that they should be. Something that was not, or that was owned by somebody that may have been taken away or lost, now coming back into their possession. Regaining what was rightfully yours. And we see this, don't we, all the way through the Bible, this redemption narrative. You see it at the fall. Adam and Eve, humanity, initially in that close, intimate relationship with God. And then it gets broken. And so actually the story of the Bible is God seeking to bring humanity back into relationship with Him. That's the redemption. That rightful relationship being restored. The Exodus, God's people being abused in Egypt and then being released to worship God, to worship Him, in freedom. And so the book of Ruth fits into this redemption narrative. We've got Naomi, going from Bethlehem into Moab, losing everything. She loses her husband, her daughters, her sons marry, they lose, the daughters-in-law lose their husbands. You've got Naomi now coming back, but having lost everything. And so we see this sense of this redemption narrative coming in. And so we have this desire for justice, for shalom, for peace. And, the redemption narrative that we see in Ruth is sort of reflective of the bigger redemption narratives that we see through the Bible, and ultimately we're going to see in Jesus. So to see redemption coming all the way through the book of Ruth is important. And it is a foretaste of the ultimate redemption that we're going to see in Jesus. And so, to look at that as well. So as we look at Ruth chapter 4, to be considering the issue of redemption. So, the 5 W's. I'm just going to go with it. We've got the 5 W's. We'll go with that. So we've got migration and the marginalised. And so here in Ruth chapter 4, we've already seen Naomi and Ruth obviously coming back, but now we've got them coming back as settled and centered. No longer migrants, no longer on the edges, but coming into the center, centered and settled as the story goes on. We have also, from what was in Ruth chapter 3, of an event taking place at night, here we have an event taking place in the daytime. We have an event taking place in the public square, as it were, at the city gate. And we have Boaz looking for, Naomi's closest guardian or kinsman redeemer to come and redeem the land, make it right, bring justice to Naomi. Naomi, who is going to be losing, her land, losing her rights, he's saying there is somebody who should be taking that responsibility. And so the closest guardian or kinsman redeemer comes up, and interestingly, he remains nameless. He has no name. That's how unimportant he is to the writer of the book of Ruth. Mr. So-and-so, Mr. What's his name, Mr. Who'd-you-call-it, is essentially what the Hebrew sort of says. Mr. So-and-so comes. And so Boaz meets with Mr. So-and-so and says to Mr. So-and-so, Mr. What's his name, will you are Naomi's closest redeemer, will you redeem the land? Mr. So-and-so, seeing a nice quick deal, goes, yeah, I can do that. I can redeem that land. He sees a quick buck to be made. He says, yeah, I'll take that land. This is going to increase the land that I have. This will increase my status. Why not? Let's do it, sort of thing. And then Boaz comes in and says, yeah, it's the land, but it's also Naomi and Ruth. You have other responsibilities. And all of a sudden, the costliness of redemption frightens off Mr. So-and-so, Mr. What's his name. Suddenly he's like, oh, hang on, I don't want this. Redemption is costly. We may see, the sense of something easy, but actually it is costly. It is going to be risky. And actually, as we see throughout the Bible, we see that redemption and the cost of redemption, and we see the risk of redemption. This is not cheap grace. Redemption is not cheap, but it's costly. Mr. So-and-so chooses his own ease and his own sort of situation, his own wealth, over that sense of redemption. Some would also say, as we're looking at sort of the everyday life, I think it may be a little bit unfair, but some have likened sort of the relationship between Ruth and Orpah, Naomi's daughters-in-law. Ruth chose the risky route of following Naomi back to Bethlehem. Orpah took the route of staying in her own land, probably marrying again, having the family, having the security in that way. It was Ruth who took the risky route of going back with Naomi, of leaving her people. And so redemption is costly. It is risky. But God honours those risks and those costs that people are willing to, in this situation, that Boaz is willing to take, that Ruth has been willing to take. And as we look at redemption in the bigger sense, we see the cost that it is to our Heavenly Father as well. And so we have this situation where Boaz says, I will take the land, I will take Naomi, and I will take Ruth. Now, this idea of levirate marriage, Moen talked about this last week, this sense of, when a husband dies, well then the family have got to sort of take responsibility and we get remarried. To our ears, it just sounds a little bit odd. I don't know if it sounds, maybe everyone goes, perfectly fine. To my Western ears, this sounds a little bit odd, but when we look at it in terms of justice, we look at it in terms of making sure that wealth is not concentrated in a few hands, making sure that as a people, as God's people, people are looked after, nobody is left to sort of fall off the edge. We see justice walking all the way through. And actually we can see this reflection of God's character coming all the way through. We see hesed, we see this mercy, this loving kindness working all the way through this area of making sure that Naomi and Ruth are being looked after. Boaz is showing hesed in redeeming the land, in making sure that Ruth is well looked after, that Naomi is looked after. But he's doing it because it is a reflection of who God is. So when we see Naomi and Ruth being looked after, we see a God who cares for people. We see loving kindness in Boaz's everyday life. We see Ruth and Naomi in everyday life being looked after. And even when we don't see the impact of it, it remains the right thing to do this loving kindness. So in our contexts, our workplaces, our families, our weeks, where are we able to show hesed, that loving kindness? We've looked at the events that are going all the way through this week, Monday through Sunday. Each one of those events that takes place here at Carley is an opportunity to reflect hesed, to reflect loving kindness to the community, because that is who God is. We're reflecting who God is in our families, in our workplaces. Where are those opportunities to show God's loving kindness, the loving kindness of God? Where are those opportunities to be looking out for people? Boaz does this just in his everyday life. And then obviously ultimately redemption gets, God's loving kindness gets pulled out when we see it in the life, in the death and the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus. But we see these things happening in everyday life. There's loving kindness. And then we see the impact. We have the joy of seeing the impact of this loving kindness. And to some extent, we see sort of the women coming back involved here. Once the deal is done through the sandals, Deb said to me, what's with the sandals? I said, I don't know. It's just what they did. I said, why is signing a piece of paper what we do nowadays? She says, yeah, but a piece of paper isn't dirty. I don't know why the sandal. Interestingly in here, isn't it? The writer of Ruth understands that the first hearers of Ruth, they probably also didn't understand why all of a sudden the sandal was going to be taken off. So if the first readers didn't understand it, I'm all right with not understanding it myself a couple of thousand years later. But there is that sense, isn't it? I guess one thing with the sandal is it's a very physical example of the agreement that's been made. And again, there's not this sense of not cheap grace. But we get this event that's taking place at the city gate, and then we get the elders saying, we're witnesses, and may the Lord make a woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah in verse 11, who together build up the family of Israel, may you have standing and all that. And then the women become involved again. They take centre stage. So the men come in for a little bit, for the legal side, and then the women sort of come back in to take centre stage. And we have these blessings, don't we? The blessings, may this woman coming in, may Ruth and Naomi be like Rachel and Leah, the matriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. We see the honour that the children of Rachel and Leah, or that Rachel and Leah are brought in. And that's the blessing that is given. And we then see this strange declaration to Perez. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah. This is going back to an event that is described in Genesis chapter 38. Strange time. It comes in the middle of sort of the story of Joseph. We have Joseph who, is abandoned by his brothers and then goes into and gets taken into Egypt. And we have this strange piece in Genesis chapter 38, whereby the messed up nature of the family of Jacob gets sort of highlighted. The messed up nature of the children of Rachel and Leah gets highlighted. And this is the blessing that gets given. And actually, it speaks into the sense of God does not expect perfection from all of his people. God works through, not perfection, but works through the messiness of everyday life. Genesis 38 is a perfect example of a dysfunctional family. It is this dysfunctional family that God chooses to be the blessing to the rest of the world. This is where God's blessing comes, through this dysfunction, through these difficult situations. So we have this Perez who Tamar bore to Judah. Tamar, who is Judah's father-in-law. No, hang on. Judah, who is Tamar's father-in-law. Tamar, who is Judah's daughter-in-law. It is messed up. And you can go into Genesis 38 to look at it. But actually, when we look at Tamar in this situation, who bore Perez, we see a woman who was not accorded the protection she should have been by Judah and by his family. A woman who was essentially left abandoned when Judah's first two sons died, and the third son was not given in marriage to her. She was left out. And actually, Tamar is the one who sort of takes things, she takes some sort of responsibility. She should not have had to do that. And in Genesis 38, Judah says, Tamar is more righteous than I am. That sense that God uses the difficult situations that we find ourselves in to bring honour to him. Redemption comes through these difficult situations. And so that's where sort of Perez and Judah come into this story. That sense that redemption is not easy. Redemption does not necessarily come through the sort of these perfect situations, but redemption comes through everyday life. As we walk with people in our everyday lives, that knowledge that we do not need to be perfect to be used by God, and people do not need to be perfect to come to God. Actually, if we are perfect, what do we need? We actually need to acknowledge our lack of perfection. We need to acknowledge those areas in our lives where there is need. And as we walk alongside people, why would we expect perfection? Let's show the hesed, that loving kindness, in the everyday lives that people are living. We've got God's imagination here working through our everyday lives. And so as the story moves on, we get the women coming and saying to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, and we get them naming the child, usually the role of the men in society, but we get the women naming the child, that central place that women are playing in this story of Ruth. And interestingly, isn't it, we see now sort of the comparison between Ruth chapter 1 and Ruth chapter 4. We have in Ruth chapter 1, Ruth coming and Naomi coming empty. And in Ruth chapter 4, Naomi and Ruth are full. We have them from a place of mourning, of losing everything, to a place of rejoicing. A place of bitterness, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. To a place of blessing, a place of being blessed and providing that blessing. The family name has been maintained. And we see that celebration. And the celebration in the good news of what is going on. But also that knowledge that Naomi and Ruth's life has been shaped by the experiences that they have gone through. Redemption does not remove the experiences that we have gone through, but it redeems those experiences. It shapes who we are. Our experiences will shape who we are. Our experiences are shaping the lives of the people that we're walking alongside. And redemption will come from within that, not outside of that. Redemption will not take people outside of their experiences, but will bring that redemption within those experiences. One of the things I have the privilege of doing is a regular Bible study with some young men. And, these are young men who are going through, some of them difficult things, some of them are sort of everyone's very young to me now. But, they're in their early 20s. Some of them are in their late 20s, early 30s. And it's interesting to see. But, they've all got hopes and dreams. And in this Bible study, we talk about going through the difficult times now. And, they go, well, how do we know everything's going to be all right? And the men in their early 30s go, well, it will be okay, because that's my experience. But actually, for those who are living it, we don't know. But this is the sense of living in the now and the not yet, as we talked about at the beginning there, that sense of that waiting. Here we have the results. We have this blessing. But we do live in this now. We live in this hope, in the now of the not sure. We have a hope in the not yet. And so actually, as we walk through with people may be not sure, is this going to work out for me? It's easy reading it here in Ruth. Everything works out. But we don't know what it's going to work out. We don't know what things are going to happen. And that's part of the joy of being alongside people, but celebrating when we do see this redemption. I have the hope for the men in my Bible study. I have hope for the people who come to events here at Carley, that everything ultimately will be all right, because I believe in what Jesus has done, and I believe Jesus is coming back again. I believe in his justice. That's the hope that sustains us. But as we live through that can be difficult. So we walk alongside people in the midst of that. And then finally, we look at the Messiah. We look at this genealogy, the situation oftentimes that we are, we're often reluctant to look at genealogies. We're like, oh, they don't really mean anything to us. But what an absolute joy to read this genealogy, to see what is happening here in Ruth chapter 4, as it goes from Perez, this son of Tamar and Judah, as was mentioned, and goes through to King David, the king, the royal line that is part of God's blessing for his people. And then when we go into Matthew chapter 1, we see this line, but we see it in its bigger sense. We see what comes before, we see what comes after. So I love it in Matthew chapter 1, where we get the genealogy. We have Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So here we see Rahab. Again, a story that we see as God's people came into the land. Somebody who helped the people. But she herself was not perfect. But that was who God used. So we see in the line of Ruth and of Obed, we see Boaz, we see Rahab, and then we see David, and then we go all the way through David, and then we ultimately come, don't we, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, who is called Messiah. And so we see this story of Ruth, which is pointing us towards King Jesus. Not just King David, but pointing us towards King Jesus. And we see this sense of redemption. And we see what redemption means. And if you come on a Wednesday to our Bible studies, we're looking at this idea of being alongside. We're talking about being alongside us. And one of the things that we're talking about is being an oak of righteousness, which is something taken from Isaiah 61. As we look at Isaiah 61, we see the words that Jesus uses in the book of Luke, in Luke chapter 4, where he starts his earthly ministry. And we get this sense as we look at sort of the scope of redemption. We get this sense of, as we see, we saw going from empty to full, from mourning to rejoicing. We get this in Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me. This is what Jesus said. Because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendour. And Jesus, when he quotes this, says, today this is fulfilled in your presence. So we get this direct line from Ruth through to Jesus. We get this direct line as we see in the life of Ruth and Naomi. Empty to full, mourning to rejoicing, bitterness to blessing. We see that in Isaiah 61. We see that coming through to Jesus. And we see this sense, don't we, as we see the Messiah. That we know that there is no other name, as the book of Acts says, under heaven and earth by which we must be saved. And so the book of Ruth, Naomi and Boaz, the story of Ruth, is the forerunner of Jesus' redemption. It is a reminder that God wants to redeem and make things right, and the sense that he will do it. So that is the hope as we read the book of Ruth. And I found on the internet this prayer, and I want to finish us as we move on from the book of Ruth, and then we're going to be moving into a time of communion. But I want to finish our time looking at Ruth chapter 4 with this benediction that is said to us. May the Lord make us a people of hesed, of loving kindness, acting worthily in our Bethlehem, renowned not for our names but for his, until every Naomi is comforted and every Ruth belongs, and the world sees the strength of our Redeemer. Let me pray as we come into a time of communion where we celebrate and remember the redemption that we have. Father, I want to thank you that you place us in our own Bethlehem. So I want to thank you for those relationships that you have given to us. I want to thank you that those relationships are more important to you even than they are to us, important though they are to us. And Father, I want to pray that we will know what it is to be redeemed. I want to pray that those people that we walk alongside will know a redemption that comes to me. I want to pray for us, for those of us who are waiting in various situations. Would we know your presence? Would we know what it is to hope in you and to rest in your hope as we wait? And Father, as we wait, I want to pray that we will know what it is also to be redeemed, that we will know the joy of those moments as well. We want to thank you for the encouragement of the book of Ruth. We want to thank you that you redeemed a difficult situation. You brought your redemption. And I want to thank you for the foreshadow of what that book is to the living Lord Jesus. And just pray that as we now celebrate communion, that redemption that we have, and as we look to where it is that you're going to send us out, would we go out to bring blessing and honour